Hello. Welcome to this episode of Rule of Carnage.
I like podcasting Glenn's voice. This is a good one.
This is a series of conversations, chats, videos, podcasts, when I get round to posting them up, about designing better miniatures games between myself, Glenn Ford, a games designer and developer, and my good chum, Mike Hutchinson, also a games designer and developer.
Hello.
Um, Hello. Yes, we talk about hopefully designing better miniatures games here. So
We certainly
quite
talk
a
about miniature games.
yes, at least we talk about miniatures games and designing them. Quite a while ago, somebody posted up a video about the idea of cursed problems in game design. And I watched that video and I went away and I made a list of cursed problems. And they've been sitting on the chat stack for a little while.
And
And
some of the ones that you came up with felt like really, really specific to miniature games, and some were like prevalent in miniature games but can be applied elsewhere. I think this one that we talk about here might be very relevant to miniature games, but also escapes into other game formats.
absolutely. So, a cursed problem, which as we're defining it, as they defined it in this in the lecture we're watching, is two things that are sort of mutually incompatible, and you want them both in your game, basically.
Want them
And
both, you can't have them both. That will. And the problem with a cursed problem is that it quite often sends you in like a little loop of iterating your game over and over, because you're like, well, I'll fix this. Oh, it's broken it. Well, I'll fix this and it's broken that, and it's fixed it. And you just keep going round and round because the two things can't be incorporated. They can't be. They can't both be true.
absolutely. So the first one coming up with is um, you often hear about games that it's possible to win until the last dice roll of the game. That
Yeah.
it's possible to win until the last combat.
Good. It keeps the tension up. It's
Oh,
excitement right until the last moment.
absolutely fantastic, brilliant. It's all going to be climactic, and it's all going to end on the last moment of the game. But we want every choice, every decision, and every dice roll of the game to matter. You don't want it to be like, what did you all do on the first turn? It doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter because we just rolled a dice on the last turn to see who won.
Exactly. Only the last decision of the game mattered, because it was always possible for either player to win on that last dice roll. So the rest of the decisions, I was just asleep or picking things randomly. And how do you even those two things out?
Mm-hmm.
They can't both be true simultaneously. Where do you put the weighting? Why do you put the weighting one way or the other? So
Have you actually played a game where that like slightly hollow marketing claim is true, that you can win with the last dice roll? I can think of one specific example that isn't like a joke example.
I mean, there are a whole bunch of games that can be won or lost on a single decision. I mean, right off the top of your head, Jenga.
Yeah.
Jenga can always be won or lost on every single decision of the
Yeah,
game.
because the decision that ends the game is the final one. So like every person's next decision could be the one that finishes the game. Which is actually kind of an interesting way of thinking about it, because we don't tend to think about games in those terms when we're thinking about miniature games,
Mm.
because we've got a culture of, it's taken us a lot of preparation to get to the table. We don't want the game to end unexpectedly. So we don't really give ourselves the design space to say every decision could end the game and thus is exciting.
Yeah, and the counter example that proves a rule to that is War Machine. Um, Famously, you could finish a game of War Machine in like 3 moves.
Right, yeah. If you had the
Literally,
right alpha strike technique, you could kill the caster, and when the caster dies, the enemy army is eliminated and the game is over. Great
absolutely,
point.
and War Machine had a very definitive and let's say audience splitting ethos to it. Um, but that decision was perfect for the sort of hardcore,
Right.
tournament player kind of ethos of that game, to go
Yeah.
like, yeah, if you're gonna like roll in there and alpha strike and punch them out, you can win the first round of your tournament game like in 3 minutes and be back in the bar. Was so like War Machine.
Hmm.
And the decision to do that is one of the things I think like, you know, really sort
And so
of.
that's quite an intentional designed set like scenario in which the game can end in that way. The example that I was thinking of, and I will spare the poor designer's name by not mentioning which game this was, but there was a game with a scenario. It was like a skirmish game, and the scenario was to gather some animals. And if you gathered the animal, like I think there were three animals, and if you gathered the animals, then at the end of the game, for each of the animals that you had gathered, you rolled a dice and you got D3 victory points. So because there were three animals, and it was possible basically to split them in such a way where I can get one animal and you get two, but I just roll a three on my D3 and you roll two ones. And so literally the last dice roll is the only one that matters. It doesn't matter how many animals we've got. It's simply whether, yeah, I mean, it's not strictly because I have to have the one animal, but
Yeah, no, that I think like historically a lot of old GW games I seem to remember things where your VP translated out into dice rolls, which were always like, so I could have
yeah, and
like.
these aren't like these don't feel like intentionally designed sort of
No.
attempts to meet that marketing claim head on.
Yeah,
But then if
yeah,
we swing
absolutely.
over to the other side of the equation, like every decision matters. Like there are, we've both played games where the opening couple of decisions that we make in the game feel absolutely critical, or we make poor decisions. This might be more true for me. Make poor decisions in the opening couple of opportunities for decisions, which put us so much on the back foot that you feel like, well, now the rest of the game, like the game can only be won on the first dice roll. The rest of the game doesn't matter. That's the sort of inverted problem.
Yeah, well, I think like on the other end of a game that is really fantastic and where like every decision can matter is something like Malifaux. Like
Hmm.
if you play high end tournament Malifaux, literally every decision you make can really matter and affect like the whole outcome of the game. And if you're not in the mindset for that, it's absolutely exhausting.
Yeah.
You know, and sort of okay that those are two like extremes of like tournament play versions of.
If I might just ruminate briefly on why I think Malifaux specific or how it specifically achieves it in a way that some other games are less effective at doing it. Although I think that there's some reflection of this in like modern 40k, but like in high level Malifaux, everything's about the economy. Like you've got an action point economy, and you've got like an economy in the cards that you have available to you, and the soul stones that you have available, and spending your resources in the correct place in the correct order to counter the things like that's the dance. And often in miniature games we do have this exchange of resources where wounds and activation points are the thing. But I think that um making your game design be really tight around the uh, the irreversibility of some of those resource spend decisions, like moving a model or activating a model, like that creates a space where, and I'm not saying this is good. I'm saying here you move your game towards a very tight resource. Every decision is meaningful because you can't unspend that resource, rather than a slightly more forgiving game where like it's a little bit easier to unmake decisions, or you've got a bit more time and the game's not so punishing about like how much time you've got to achieve things. And
Yeah, and I think like in each of these sort of curse problem conversations, the answer is going to be, well, what you've really got is a kind of like splatter diagram, and you're moving your game somewhere around between these poles to define the way that you want your game to feel.
that's
And
I
I
think
like.
why I find these curse problems, this idea of a curse problem, so valuable, is because it takes something which on the surface, like the sort of junior designer in me, the naive designer in me goes, well, I'm going to make the best game ever. It's going to be both A and B. And to hear that A and B are mutually incompatible, but they lie on a sort of complicated plot where I can make some decisions and some compromises, is for me like a really helpful and healthy way of thinking about it.
Yeah, and I think the thing about something like Malifaux is that what exactly it is that you need to do during the game is generally quite clear at the start of the game.
Mm.
You have these various schemes that you've got to complete. They're sort of quite labyrinthine and how they click together, and you can generally see a lot of the game sort of before you begin, and you have quite tight resources with which to achieve those things.
Mm.
Whereas comparing that to something like Warhammer Fantasy Battle or Warhammer the Old World, what it is that is going to be important on like turn 5 and 6 in a lot of those games is almost impossible for even experienced players to tell at the start, because you've got an enormous amount of resource,
Mm.
very little of which like is necessarily going to matter, and it's usually not until like turn 3 or 4 that that game sort of really focuses in and takes shape, and you go, right, that hill is going to
That's
be.
true. Yeah, you've got a wad of cash in terms of like the wounds of your army, but it turns out that some of the money in your army is just going to be the only money that matters, and
Yeah, and
it looks
it's
like it looks all the same at the start.
and I think a lot of games answer that question of every decision matters by, it is not possible to win the game on turn 1. It's possible to lose the game on turn 1. You can screw up so badly at the beginning
Mm.
that you're on a hiding to nothing, but you cannot take it, be up against a competent opponent and definitively win it on turn 1. And
Right.
usually it's like turn 1, 2, and 3 are the points where you could do something boneheaded and lose. And then like turns 4, 5, and 6 are the points where you do something brilliant and win.
Mm.
Rather than it being the way it matters on turn 1 is that you win on turn 1. And because in respect of winning is taking the thing away from your opponent. It's taking their opportunity to win away. So you don't want to like give people that ability very early on, because it's removing agency from the other player. But
Mm.
it is okay to give them the ability to throw their own agency away by making dumb decisions, because they'll learn or they'll grow or they'll be able to see those things.
Right, and also there is a nasty side to the other of that, which is like, well, if you just put like inflatable bumpers down the bowling, like, do my decisions even matter if you keep like shoving me back into my decision, me as a player still having an opportunity to win, even though I made very terrible decisions early on, like,
Absolutely. And so it's like, and I think Warhammer Fantasy Battle / Old World is a good example of this, where you can definitively lose a game of, say, Fantasy Battle during the setup phase.
mm,
You cannot win it during the setup phase. You can give
right,
yourself the opportunity to later win it, and you can lose it on turns 1 and 2. You realistically, unless things go incredibly weird with the dice, you realistically can't win it on either of those turns. And
mm,
it's usually over by turn 4, and then there's a couple of turns of like mopping up and shouting at each other. But and it's interesting, I think, like with, like, to turn to one of your designs, Hobgoblin very much sort of went to skip out those like first turn or two of a Warhammer Fantasy Battle game and go to the, well, it's turn 3 and 4 where we start like making the decisions that let us win. Let's skip the bit where really all we can do is potentially lose, and go to the bit where we can start doing things that mean we can
does the
potentially
gentle
win.
listener imagine that perhaps Mike has lost a game of Warhammer in turns 1 or 2?
Mike
But
has
you're
lost some games
actually,
of Warhammer during the setup phase.
yeah, that's true. I never did
um,
think of that.
so I think in general, like in relation to this idea, yes, it is possible to win the game on the last roll of the dice in a game of a set and significant length. Probably is marketing bump of some kind or another, and if it is genuinely true, it is a very spiky design decision. Every choice matters. Probably also bump, and if it is genuinely true, again, you're right on a pole of doing something quite specific and intentional. And
Mm.
probably your game is going to want to be somewhere between those two poles. And the way in which I think that you do that is about the level of clarity you give to a player at the start of the game on exactly how you will win or lose, and therefore exactly what your like decision plan needs to be, and how clearly you can achieve those steps or not achieve them even early on in the game, and the level of resources that you give a player and the way in which those resources are winnowed down into something interesting, and therefore the way in which the game focuses and takes shape, and when it takes shape and when it becomes clear what will be the winning moment and the winning resolution, and those will sort of, yeah, I think define the shape of the game.
I think one other element I'd like to add to this discussion is that I, at least my tendency as a designer, I have found that randomness, like randomness in the emergent stuff that happens as a result of your decisions, can be a really fun way of playing around with this. So things like the wipeout and the flips and stuff in Gaslands, there's like there's moments where your decisions matter, and then there's games where there's moments where the game takes sort of agency away from the players and just sort of shakes things up a bit. And so like in a game of Gaslands, it's completely possible to lose it on the first turn and make some bad decisions and end up somebody else is tearing away and stuff. But one of the ways that that can be balanced out in a game is if you introduce some randomness where it's not certain like how the game state is going to suddenly shake out. So I think that's something that I end up thinking about quite a lot, is that I don't want every decision to matter, and I sometimes want decisions that have been made to sometimes get shook up and be recontextualized because something random just happened, and now a playing piece is in a different location, like a miniature is in a different location to where everyone expected it, and now we get to look at the table and go, okay, right, okay, we all better reconsider what's going on here. And I think if you do that too much, then the game kind of becomes chaotic and there's no strategy. But I think that's what I like. That's my preference as a designer and as a player, is to have like sometimes the game is like burbling out these little bubbles of randomness and shaking things up so that your decisions, you may have made some good decisions, but they might end up getting recontextualized.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk in a little while about the idea of mastery in games. But I think that one of the things that's interesting about throwing in like those recontextualizing moments is that the part of the mastery arc of a game with those in is learning to ride those bumps. It's like the
Knowing that they
Gaslands.
can happen, having seen a few of them, knowing how to set yourself up for most of the outcomes being okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the realization that in Gaslands that flipping being destroyed can win you the race
Mm.
and give you a real jump head on the competition is one of those moments where a good player will go, yeah, I'm going to bring the randomness into my plan and make it one of my tools and my weapons.
Yeah, and as
Um,
I'm working on Space Kits, I'm trying to find similar places where uh where emergent splashy things that like, because there's a lot of randomness in Space Kits because like dice fall over all over the place and they can knock other dice and stuff. So there's a lot of like physical randomness. But yeah, this is on my mind at the moment because I like when it comes to Space Kits, I want to capture the same thing that I did with Gaslands, in that like the physical act of playing with the toys on the table is fun and enjoyable, but there is some grit and there is some like, yeah, there is some mastery to it. And so trying to navigate that path between every decision is like a gritty strategic decision versus like, hey, it doesn't really matter because we're just going to keep having random silliness explode until the game ends and the last person who didn't explode is the winner, hooray. So yeah.
yeah, well, every game is a sort of a set of compromises between poles, I think, and like you
Game design, making compromise fun.
well, you can't have everything, and
Mm.
I think that it's been well said that the thing made for everybody and the thing that tries to do everything ends up being for nobody and ends up being nothing, and
Indeed.
staking your claim on an area within this sort of scatter diagram. So like I say, I ultimately am not a huge fan of War Machine, but I love that they went, yeah, you can win on your third activation. Suck it, I respect that a lot, even though it's like it's not particularly a game for me. And being able to do that and like do it with style and a LAN and with a knowledge of what you want to be and how you want to do it, I think is a great way to make a good game. And I think on that, we will roll up this particular conversation. We're going to hopefully talk about a few cursed problems, but if you can swing down into the comments section and tell us if there's a cursed problem that you think exists within minis games, or games generally, the one that maybe you've bumped up against in your own designs, or in playing games and wanting both of these things to come out of a certain game and being frustrated they didn't and learning why they didn't. That'd be great because I've got a list of them, but it never hurts to have more for extra conversations.
Yeah, well, I mean, more generally speaking, all of those would be great topics potentially, and if you have other topics that you have either not heard us talk about before or think that we should revisit, give us some ideas for topics. We're always hungry to add to the list.
Absolutely. And when you're down there doing that, give the like and subscribes a little puncharoo, and check out the links section because there's links over there to various places where you can buy our games, which would be a great way to support the channel. And links over to our Patreons where you can swing by and directly give us money for putting out these videos. And then you can swing over to the Discord and have a chat and a conversation with us about the fact that you've done that, about cursed problems, about anything you want, really. We're fairly
Well, and
personable and
listen,
approachable people.
if you're designing a miniatures game or working on a miniatures game or just tinkering with a miniatures game, come over into the Discord. There are so many people tinkering and designing and solving problems that there's always someone to chat to about the thing that you're working on. So yeah, we love you to be
Absolutely.
there.
But for now, and from this episode of Rule of Carnage, I think it'll be a thank you and goodbye. So bye bye.
Goodbye. Bye bye.